Good evening. Sir Keir Starmer decides to make PMQs about me. I wasn't quite sure why. He then decided to make a series of accusations. I will give you my answer to his charges this evening, live here in just a few minutes. Is it worth 31 million quid for security, extra security for members of Parliament, or have they brought this all upon themselves? The debanking row is one I sense that will never go away until we get real legislative and cultural change, as we learn that 140,000 small businesses have been disgracefully debanked in the course of the last year, and a packet of fags could go up to 16 quid in the budget next week. Doesn't this just drive the black market and actually make illegal drugs become rather attractive? All of that in a moment, but first, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, we start this evening with the sad news that the bodies of at least 3 suspected migrants have been pulled from the English Channel this afternoon. A major search and rescue operation was launched following the incident. The UK and French authorities now working together on that. It's believed people smuggling gangs pushed a number of boats into the water throughout the day. Despite the bad weather, people smuggling gangs were seen pushing multiple small boats, and 300 people were taken to Border Force processing centres at Dover Harbour. Farmers are warning that their industry will be at risk if the Welsh Government goes ahead with proposed changes to farming subsidies. Outside the Welsh Parliament, they protested against the plans, which require 20% of agricultural land to be set aside for trees and wildlife habitats. The Labour government insists the changes are necessary to fight climate change, but conceded the plan could still be adjusted at the end of a consultation. But unions are warning there'll be thousands of job losses, and the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew Davies, told GB News it'll be disastrous for the country.
Well, let's not forget, people need food to survive and live on their everyday existence. So we're not talking about an industry here that isn't required to feed the nation. And if we don't have farmers, we don't have food. And by the government's own figures, if this scheme goes ahead unchanged, 5,500 farmers will lose their livelihoods, 125,000 cattle will be lost in Wales, 800,000 sheep, and £200 million worth of economic activity will be lost. So it'll be a devastating impact on rural communities the length and breadth of Wales.
MPs facing threats to their safety will get extra security as part of a new £31 million government package. Concerns are growing about MPs being targeted by protesters since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war. The Home Office says the money will be used to increase private sector security provision, and all elected representatives will have a dedicated named police contact to liaise with. And the High Court in Belfast has today ruled the UK government's controversial Legacy Act breaches human rights laws. The case was brought by the relatives of Northern Ireland's Troubles victims. The Act includes a conditional amnesty for people suspected of committing offences. In delivering the ruling, the judge said there's no evidence immunity will in any way contribute to reconciliation in the country. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris said earlier the government still intends to implement the Act. That's the news. For the very latest stories, do sign up to GB News Alerts or scan the QR code on your screen right now, or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
I just landed on the overnight flight from Miami, and PMQs started at midday. And I assumed that what Keir Starmer would do is go on the Lee Anderson story. Why? Because that splits the party opposite. Some members of Parliament for the Conservatives think he went way too far. Others think his suspension is ridiculous and electorally bad news. But no, he didn't do that. He wanted, for some reason, to talk about me. Have a look.
He also claimed, Mr. Speaker, that Nigel Farage is the man to restore the Tory party. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether he too would welcome Mr. Farage back into the Tory fold?
Mr. Speaker, in our party, we have a proud tradition of diversity and accepting everyone from every background. Indeed, it is a proud record that puts Labour to shame, Mr. Speaker.
So this diverse Tory party does welcome Nigel Farage. The Prime Minister 2 months 2 months ago, the Prime Minister said the Tory party is a broad church. I welcome lots of people who want to subscribe to our ideals and our values. This is the same Nigel Farage who said he agreed with the basic premise of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech and bemoaned the influence of the Jewish lobby. So is the Prime Minister simply too scared to stand up to the gaggle of Tory MPs who moonlight as GB presenters, or does he genuinely think Nigel Farage shares the ideals and values of the Tory party?
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I think somebody might be slightly worried. You see, here's the point. Here's the point. Back in 2015, actually Labour benefited hugely from UKIP taking Tory votes. But from thereafter, actually, we were really, really hurting Labour, hurting them in a really, really big way. And of course, Brexit. 4 million Labour voters voted Brexit. Yes, the very same Brexit that you, Mr Starmer, wanted to overturn and force us into a second referendum. And here's the point. When he says, I agree with the basic premise of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, well, the basic premise was that uncontrolled mass immigration would lead to divided societies in our cities that became unrecognisable and that could lead to conflict. Well, have a look at what happened with the intimidation of members of Parliament last week. And have a look at the fact, Sir Keir, that there are many parts of our major cities in England that are now frankly unrecognisable, and millions of your voters know that. And to say that I bemoan the influence of the Jewish lobby, no, quite the reverse. I said the Jewish community in North America had been massively successful in law, in business, and yes, they did campaign for what they wanted. They did it within the law. They did it quite successfully, but I was never a subscriber to the madcap conspiracy theory that the Jews run the world. But I tell you who was. Yes, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader that you supported. Yes, Jeremy Corbyn. And you went to a conference, Sir Keir, where there was a Palestinian flag on the chair of every Labour MP. And you and your own party, some sitting in the House of Commons, some prospective parliamentary candidates who basically don't want Israel to exist. I tell you what, if you want to have a fight with me over anti-Semitism, any day of the week. Now, moving on to the really big story of the day. £31 million has been approved to up the security of members of Parliament. Is this the right thing to do? Well, regular viewers to this show will know I have been predicting for a very, very long time that MPs would soon start to understand what my life was like for over a decade. If I'd not had chauffeur-driven cars, if I'd not had close personal protection, I very much doubt I'd be sitting here talking to you now. That's how vile and vicious and frankly dangerous it was when I was leading UKIP. Now some of these chickens are coming home to roost for members of Parliament. But a lot of GB News viewers are saying, hang on, we shouldn't spend any more money on these people because, after all, it's they themselves, through supporting irresponsible immigration policies, that have led to the danger on our streets. Got to tell you, folks, for once, I'm not with the majority of GB News viewers. I think unless we do more to protect our members of Parliament, there are going to be more disasters ahead. And unless we know that becoming an MP, is a relatively, yes, of course, you accept brickbats, but is a relatively safe thing to do, we will put off the kind of good, brave people that we need to stand for Parliament, to get into Parliament, to turn this mess around. So you tell me, I'm expecting a flurry of disagreements. Do MPs need more protection? Farage at gbnews.com. I'm joined by Mark Francois, MP, Conservative for Rayleigh and Wickford, and Will Geddes, security expert and consultant. Mark, you were a very close personal friend of a neighbouring Member of Parliament, Sir David Amess.
Yes.
Who was brutally murdered, actually doing his job as a Member of Parliament, wasn't he?
Yes, he was murdered by an Islamist extremist whose name I can't even bring myself to pronounce.
Ali Harvey.
Well, all right. But he said at his trial at the Old Bailey that he did it because of the way that David had voted in the House of Commons. So I still miss my friend. He was my best friend in Parliament. So, this is close to my heart, Nigel. And it's a shame in a way that we're even having to have this discussion. But I think we are where we are. And we somehow need to get this balance right, because there are some people that would like to turn the Houses of Parliament into a fortress with razor wire and lasers and no visitors, and, you know, we could do that. But if we do that, I would argue the bad guys are winning. That's what they want. They want us to become even more remote than some people would argue we already are.
One or two Labour voices today suggesting, well, it's very easy. We'll work from home and vote online. That would be surrender, wouldn't it?
That absolutely would be. One of the benefits of voting in person is you can get to ministers, because they've got to go through the division lobby as well.
Yeah,
so, you know, if a minister's been hiding away on some constituency issue for a month, when they go in to vote, they haven't got a civil service protection. That's when you grab them. That's how you represent your constituents.
So this 31 million is worth spending?
I believe it is. I discussed this earlier today with Roger Hurst, who's the very proactive, actually, Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for Essex. He absolutely is very hard over on the security, not just of MPs, but of councillors as well. Remember, councillors get a lot of abuse. And I thought Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, summed it up very well today. So it's a brief quote. He said this: "Over the past few weeks, we've seen disgraceful attempts to intimidate MPs and undermine our democratic processes. That behaviour is a threat to our democracy and toxic to our society." And if I may say so, I think Tom put it really well.
OK, we'll get his perhaps a slightly more dispassionate view than Mark can possibly have on an issue like this. No, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons I wanted you here, because, you know, you've seen it, you felt it in a very, very big way. In fact, much of the country was deeply shocked.
Yeah.
When it comes to the threat, you know, the Speaker talks about this, he talks about far-right threats, and we've seen far-right threats, and they exist, but they are a fraction, are they not, of the real threat. Why is no one talking about the real threat?
Well, it's constantly a race, if you like, between the extremists, particularly from the Islamic extremist sectors, and the far-right extremists. And the far-right extremists have increased, certainly over the last few years, and they're being considered as seriously by MI5 as the Islamic extremists. But having said that, Nigel,
just look at the numbers,
if we look at it right now, we look at, obviously, a far wider and broader leaning, and also a more vocal leaning by those that are particularly in support of Palestine and the anti-Semitism that is going on right now. And I take really from both of the things that you've both said so far, yourself, Nigel, you've been at the sharp end, you've been at the spearhead of actually having threats against you. Exactly. And I think a lot of these MPs, and maybe the GB News viewers, are a little opposed to MPs having security. But I think a lot of the MPs will also know, once they feel the hot air and the hot breath of a threat that comes close to them, they recognise how serious the implications are of what they vote necessarily in the Houses of Parliament. But at the same time, I think Mark's absolutely right. You can't overkill this. Now, if we looked at the 650-odd MPs across the United Kingdom, to provide close protection for every single one of them, you know how expensive it is, Nigel. You're looking probably somewhere circa 200 to 250 million pounds a year to provide that security. So when we put that in context to the 31 million that has been allocated for this run-up, particularly to a general election, and for us to have a free democratic society, we've got to be able to have MPs that can go out, can canvass, can talk without fear of intimidation or fear of threats being levelled against them, whether it be by, you know, as with David Amess or with Joe Cox, for that matter.
But the intimidation is happening. I mean, there was a fundraising Conservative dinner in Stoke-on-Trent
I saw
the other evening, and I covered that on Monday evening.
Yeah.
There's been a council meeting somewhere in the north of England today that's been stormed by pro-Palestine demonstrators. Well, I would put it to you, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
That the real cost of doing this fully would be massive.
Yes.
And the threat, the risk of threat, that assessment changes over time. But we may need to spend more, is the point I'm making.
You're absolutely right. The group that is actually responsible for the risk assessment, and I have questions about the, if you like, the quality of the risk assessments being undertaken. It's undertaken by a group called RAVEC, which is Royalty and VIP Executive Committee, which is within the Home Office. Now, they will look at the security around the members of the royal family, they'll look at members of the cabinet and the opposition, and any other MP that potentially has a threat against them. Now, any kind of security has to be measured. It has to be balanced, and you'll know this yourself from your own experience, Nigel. One of the things, even as a provider of close protection to many former heads of state, many foreign royal families, I always say that there's a caveat when you introduce it, because it is a safety blanket that once they've had it, removing it can actually heighten one's anxiety. So that if it is in for a period of time, it has to be in for a period of time to deal with the specific threat that the individual is potentially facing. So to blanket provide it to every MP would imprison them too much.
To be fair, I don't think we're calling for that. And what,
No, I agree.
Because, and I know, Nigel, we've discussed this before, and I know you have strong views because of your own experiences. I know that. But if we get to a situation where we need a bodyguard, with some spaghetti coming out of their ear, as we're going down the bread aisle in Sainsbury's on a Saturday morning with our trolley like anybody else, then the bad guys are winning.
I agree.
Because I'm not sure I agree with that.
I know you don't, but I know you don't. But I just think, so there you are, you're walking down the bread aisle, you've got this heavy with you, and there are people walking by feeling resentful, and they're thinking, if he gets one of those people, why don't I get one of those people?
Well, what I would say, Mark, is this. When the level of threat against me was very high and constant, and I was assaulted repeatedly, even with close protection, still people got to me.
Yes.
Eggs over the head, banners over the head, all of that, But I think I found a balance with it, which was I didn't run away from street markets.
No.
I didn't run away from going out campaigning, but I did have people there who, if it really turned ugly, could help me.
But the threat to you was high. I mean,
yes, it was.
To be fair, Nigel, during the Brexit debates, I got quite a lot of stick, as you know. Not quite what you got, but a fair bit.
Mostly from your own party.
There you are. it's not boring politics, But, remember, Churchill famously said, parliamentary democracy is the worst possible system of government apart from all the others. So what we somehow have to do, and here I agree with Will, we've somehow got to get this balance right so that on the one hand, members of Parliament and their families, their loved ones, don't live in fear of what happens if they vote one way or another. But on the other hand, we don't become so protected unless it's really merited that the public resents us.
Correct. I mean, I dropped in a very quick point. I dropped in a quick point. Very quick one on this, Nigel. Of all the executives, the individuals that I've protected over the last 30-odd years, I would say, and you touched on a good point, Mark, it's about the families. Many of the principals have actually said, you know what, I don't actually want the protection myself, but I do want it for my family. That's why I hope within the risk assessments that wherever this money is assigned to whichever MP requires it, who is at the spearhead of a threat, that a lot of consideration is made for their family, and they are not left
and family
out
homes,
in the cold.
and family homes in particular.
Exactly.
Gentlemen, we could debate this for much, much longer. Folks at home, you've heard a good, I think very reasoned debate on this. Can't wait for your reactions. In a minute, well, I knew when I launched the debanking crusade that it wasn't going to be over in a few weeks, so we learned overnight that 140,000 businesses, nearly 3% of all small businesses in the UK were debanked last year. How on earth is any of this going to change unless the culture within the banks changes and Parliament starts to look at some of the legislation?
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Mike Freer joins me now. Mike, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Firstly, how are you?
It's been a busy day, and it's been quite a traumatic experience. It's a real wrench to walk away from a job that you love, but also a constituency that you've become. I live there; it's my home, and I regard many of my constituents as friends, and it is an amazing place. And to walk away from that is really it's quite an emotional wrench to think this was a job I loved, but unfortunately I can't do it anymore.
Can you talk me through the process? Because you mentioned about the alleged arson attack, etc., being the final straw, but this has been a really quite vile journey to get to this point. So what kind of threats have you had? What's that look like?
Well, like every MP, I mean, you day in, day out, you get abusive emails, you get low-level stuff that, whether we should accept it, but we do, it's graffiti, it's things like, you know, in the past I've had a mock Molotov cocktail left on the office door, meaning we had to evacuate the whole building. I've come out of my house and found a note on my car. Where I live is common knowledge, but what I drive is less so. And it's a few weeks after John Mann had the wheel nuts on his car tampered with. So that all kind of makes you get a bit, you know, what on earth's going on. But I've had 2 run-ins with the organisation that was Muslims Against Crusades, and people like Anjem Chowdhury, who was behind that organisation, been to prison. But online, it said, I used to do surgery in mosques, so I wanted to go out and see people. And online, there's a picture of me saying, you're not welcome in our mosque, like Stephen Timsby, a pointed reminder. So it's not very subtle.
Well, just for our viewers and listeners who might not remember that,
Stephen Timms, of course, was stabbed by a woman who'd been radicalised. Thank heavens he survived. So it was a very unsubtle.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, I asked you, do MPs need more protection? I did predict what the results would be, and I'm not in the least bit surprised. And I understand the emotions behind all of this. Helen says, what a disgrace. What about us? Helen not happy about the extra 31 million. Ron says, if the MPs have decided they need protection at great taxpayers' expense, is it not time they realised the people of Britain also need protecting? Derek says, if the MPs did their job, the current situation would not have been allowed to gain traction. Derek, I agree with you 100%. Misguided encouragement of multiculturalism, and by that I mean communities separating out as much as possible. And you know, the Blair government were very much at the forefront of that, and irresponsible immigration policies that have led to parts of our cities not being integrated at all. And frankly, we're being honest about it, a lot of people coming into the country from completely different cultures with whom we share very little in common. Moving on to a pet subject of mine. It's dominated my life since last July when I decided I'd blow the gaff on being debanked. And what was obvious to me at the time was that if you are debanked as an individual or a business, and in my case it was both, people don't go public. Not only is it humiliating, but you also, as a business, think it might damage your future prospects of getting an account. It may even make your customers wonder about your credit worthiness. Well, overnight, we get a report from a Treasury Select Committee, and the chair of which, Harriet Baldwin MP, Tory for West Worcestershire, joins me. And Harriet, just, you know, this is unbelievable, that in the space of the last year, 140,000 small businesses have been debanked. And of course, the reasons given, it's always the same. It's fear of financial crime or fraud, and maybe in a few cases that was legitimate and true. But it's nearly 3% of all small businesses were debanked last year. And I have to say, Andrew Griffith, who was the Treasury Minister at the time, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, did make some very warm noises that they were going to talk with the FCA and things were going to improve. Seems to me nothing's changing.
It was really startling, wasn't it, the information that we released? And we were really shocked by it. So our committee's been looking at access to finance for small and medium-sized businesses because they're the lifeblood of the UK economy. And we wrote to the big high street banks and some of the lesser-known banks, and we asked them this exact question. How many bank accounts for businesses did you close over the course of the last year? And we are really taken aback by the scale of this problem. And I think, as you say, that it's not going to be zero, is it? Because there are going to be people, as they say, who've been, abusive to their banks, or there are people who have been caught doing something fraudulent. And so, they are going to be within their rights to close those bank accounts. But we think, as a committee, that anyone who's going about a legal business activity in the United Kingdom, and they've given the Know Your Customer information to their bank, they ought to be able to find a bank who will give them a bank account.
They ought to be able to, Harry. Here's the problem, I think. The problem is, if what's seen as an unusual payment appears in a business account, and it could be a large sale or a large contract or whatever, alarm bells go off inside the bank, and immediately a whole series of pieces of legislation that mostly came in through EU money laundering directives, by the way, all of it well-intentioned, but for the bank to have to check and go through that costs them more money in compliance than they earn from the account in a year. And I just question whether what's really needed here, and this should be coming from the FCA, that, you know, the Financial Conduct Authority are there to provide a service, to make sure we're not being ripped off, we're not being treated badly by financial institutions. Parliament needs to go through this legislation and make it less onerous, surely.
Well, it also needs to come from the government and from Parliament, as you rightly say. So I think the FCA definitely has a role, and we've asked them about this, and they were the ones who confirmed that, you know, for legally held political views like yours, you're, you know, absolutely out of order to close your bank account for that. And we heard from the Minister today, so Andrew Griffith's successor is Bim Afalami, and he was telling the committee today that he's going to look again at those money laundering regulations. And he also said that he's going to bring in new rules on closing a bank account to give not just individuals but also businesses more rights when their bank decides to close their bank account.
I'm delighted that Bim has said those things today, just as I was delighted that his predecessor, Andrew Griffith, said those things. But, you know, there is an election coming up at the end of this year. There could be a change of government, who knows? Maybe one that won't take this quite as seriously. That'll be up to them, if it is them. All I'm saying to you is, Harriet, a lot of promises were made to me last year about this, because one of the reasons I raised this was I know the fear that it puts into people's hearts. I know getting new business bank accounts open can be very, very difficult, that people's livelihoods are being wrecked unfairly. I keep hearing warm words. Am I going to see any action?
Well, it sounds like you are, but I agree with you that these things often take a lot longer than people would like, and our committee is the one that sort of holds people's feet to the fire when this happens. But I do think we're going to see action, and we heard evidence in our inquiry about perfectly legitimate parts of the UK economy, like pawnbrokers, for example, like amusement arcades.
Anything to do with cash.
Anything that, you know, is slightly unusual, they seem to really struggle. And I think we've got to, on a cross-party basis, because that's where our committee's influence comes, we've got to say that this is something that we expect to change.
Great report. Shocking conclusions, but it does add and help the debate. Pressure for change. Harriet Baldwin, thank you for joining me. Now, you'll have heard on the news that there have been 3 dead bodies found in the Channel today. They were found on the French side of the Channel. There was also a reported floating body and near the Varn lifeboat, and both the Dungeness and Dover lifeboats are out now. You can see here on your screens the Dungeness lifeboat out there. I mean, these are very, very well-made boats. Look how shocking the sea conditions were. So the situation today was very simple. At sort of 5 o'clock this morning, the Channel was very, very calm. Boats started to come. Somewhere between 250 and 300 young men have come into Dover today, but after midday, conditions changed hugely. But there's one thing I want to expose here today that's never been talked about before, and it's this. I broke the story about how the French Navy literally escorts migrant boats to a 12-mile line, and then after talking on the radio, hands the vessels over to either Border Force or to the RNLI. What I've learned today is something else. That when the weather's bad, the French Navy goes up to the migrant boats and says, look, you really mustn't be here. This is very, very dangerous. And it takes off the boats those that are fearful, those that are scared, but it allows those who want to stay on to continue and escorts them off to the British. And frankly, this whole practice of the French Navy literally escorting migrant boats into British waters is one that needs to stop. Harriet Baldwin's still with me. We talked about deterrence earlier on, but I just, you know, surely the French Navy should not be escorting boats into British waters.
I agree with you.
I mean, I'm just absolutely astonished by this. I'm amazed there's not more of a fuss about it. They say the reason that they do it is that if they did try to intervene, they would literally throw themselves into the Channel. Well, frankly, I don't believe a word of it. In a moment, Donald Trump's comments on NATO, a subject about which I had a discussion with him at Mar-a-Lago 2 days ago, is increasingly being used to build and bolster the European Defence Union. We'll talk about that. Plus, was Macron wise not to rule out sending troops to Ukraine.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of 3 abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, you know, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
Affects us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think many were quite surprised by how strong Emmanuel Macron was when he refused to rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine. He said, we will do everything that we can to make sure Russia does not prevail. And if you add that to what Donald Trump said just a couple of weeks ago, hey, you know what? You're not paying the membership fee. We're not going to come as America and defend you. All of this is being used as an excuse, a political excuse, in my view, to fast-track the European Defence Union, the European Army, in everything but name. And indeed, Ursula von der Leyen in the European Parliament today said Europe must spend more, spend better, spend European. We've even seen Manfred Weber, who's the head of the EPP group, the biggest group in the European Parliament, saying that the European Union needs an independent nuclear weapon. Now, I personally believe that all Trump is trying to do is make people play the game. But I have my fears that we may be heading in a very, very odd direction. I'm joined by Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation. These statements that we're getting from Macron, von der Leyen, even though they don't spend very much money on defence, they seem to have this idea that they're going to have a very strong Navy, Air Force, Army, and maybe even nuclear deterrent. This kind of is globalisation, isn't it?
It's not. And I think what Macron was saying was essentially, we need bold new ideas for how to help Ukraine, and I'm going to present the bold idea. You, your other NATO member states, are probably going to shoot it down, but I'm going to be the person who thinks innovatively. And then what Ursula von der Leyen said in the European Parliament is essentially about how do we allocate the money we are spending, we European countries, EU member states, how do we allocate it better? Because it's saying that you're going to spend 2% is one thing, but actually you can spend 2% on a lot of things. If you look at a country like Greece, it spends around 2% and usually more, and doesn't contribute a whole lot to NATO's capabilities with that money and the things it buys for that money.
No, you can look, of course, you can spend money very badly, and we've had a few procurement problems here with the Ministry of Defence over the years where nothing's ever on budget and nothing's ever on time. But the political argument that's being used consistently now is that if Trump wins, America's going to leave NATO, America's going to walk away, that's why we need, our own European defence. And the truth of it is, Trump has never said he'd walk away from NATO as such, provided people play the game.
He likes to frighten people, and I wonder, Nigel, whether he does it merely to entertain his American audience or to please his American audience, or whether he's serious about it. But, of course, what matters is the effect it has on the countries that he's talking about. And that is the frightening thing. You would expect of an ally that if he wanted to make that case very strongly, he should pick up the phone and call the Prime Minister of the offending countries and say...
The argument here would be... And I understand the logic of what you're saying, if we were dealing with normal diplomacy. But we're dealing with Donald Trump, who does things in a very different way, and some love it, some hate it. But the argument would be that actually this same argument was being made by Obama. This same argument was being made by Clinton, the Bushes, that really ever since the wall came down, Europe has been delinquent in terms of its expenditure. And all the previous American presidents tried diplomacy, and they achieved nothing. And maybe what Trump said in Brussels in 2017 has actually helped to make members spend a bit more money.
Actually, I think the even more influential party in this equation is Vladimir Putin, and we saw...
In recent times, yeah.
In recent times, and there is nothing as sobering as a war next door or in your neighbourhood, and we have seen countries really increase their defence spending. But Nigel, here's one of the problems about increased defence spending. Who is going to make the weaponry that we are ordering, that countries are ordering from defence manufacturers? We don't have enough factory workers, so we can spend all the money. We can spend all the money we want. Where are the factory workers?
Well, that's a very good point, given that we're virtually closing down the British steel industry, for example, and the same in much of Europe too. And
if you are a factory worker in the defence manufacturing industry, that's not something that you learn in one day. These are skilled jobs, and I think this is where it really becomes reality, that we have dismantled a lot of our defence capabilities down to the factory workers, and without factory workers we are not going to be winning a war against Russia, nor are we going to be able to help Ukraine win its war against Russia.
The point about deindustrialisation is right, and I thank you for joining me. It leads me on beautifully to my next point, which is about net zero policy, because, that's the reason that Port Talbot's closing. It's so we can meet our net zero targets. Let's now talk farming in relation to net zero and regulations. Anna McMorran is the Labour Member of Parliament for Cardiff North. She asked Rishi Sunak this question in the House of Commons today.
This last weekend, the Prime Minister posed for photographs with a group that shares extremist conspiracy theories on climate change and campaigns against net zero. Does the Prime Minister share their views?
That's no way to talk about the Welsh farming community, Mr. Speaker.
Well, no wonder his own side cheered. I'd have cheered. Yes, I agree with Rishi Sunak. He was absolutely right to make that point. Shame it came from a Conservative party who just a couple of years ago actually wanted to rewild 30% of the English countryside. But never mind. Geraint Davies, dairy farmer in Wales, has been very, very prominent in a protest that has taken place today outside the Welsh Parliament, outside the Senedd. Here he was talking to GB News earlier on this afternoon. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Pleased to have you on live. Now, your protest today was of some significant size.
Yes, it's all to do with the sustainable farming scheme, the TB and the NVZ rulings that the Welsh Government are trying to implement on us.
So they want you to put 10% of your land into trees and a further other 10% of your land effectively set aside. Would that be right? They want you to take out of farming 20% of your land.
That's correct, yes. When they want to secure food security, but yet they want to take 20% basically of our agricultural land out of for this net zero climate.
And is this just, in your opinion, you know, a one-off big protest outside the Welsh Parliament, or is this the beginning of something not in quite the same vein, but something like we've seen over the rest of Europe now for several months?
No, this is. We've been having public meetings for the last month or so about the scheme that they are trying to implement. It's basically what it's all about. It's they are trying to strangle Welsh farmers. And we're no longer willing to put up with what they're trying to implement on us. If it's all about trying to keep Welsh farmers farming.
Geraint Davies, thank you for joining me here live on GB News. Well, this is a very, very common thing right across Europe. We saw protests in Dover just the other day, and even my previous package about defence. You know, if you haven't got steel factories, how on earth can you prepare for a better military? Net zero, more like nut zero, in my view. In a moment, we hear that cigarettes are going to go up to 16 quid a packet. 16 quid for a packet of fags. Surely all that does is to increase the size of the black market and actually, in many, many ways, to make illegal drugs even more attractive. Maybe vaping provides an alternative, but we're told that is going to get taxed heavily too.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, it's the question everyone's asking.
Can the Prime Minister confirm whether he too would welcome Mr Farage back into the Tory fold?
Nigel Farage is on to give you the answer, and Suella Braverman bites back.
They are in Britain, but not of Britain.
Has multiculturalism failed? Should MPs be cowering away in their own homes, hiding from the baying mob? And we are the only channel with the inside story on why Prince William missed yesterday's royal event. Don't miss Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 to 11 p.m. Be there.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Put in your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake,
basic-
civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
But I'm all right with people because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
Well, do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Well, this government says that next week it'll return to true Tory values in the budget. Part of that, of course, is the big state telling us how we can and cannot live. It would seem that's now modern conservatism. I'm surprised that they haven't put forward banning booze. But, of course, cigarettes are in the firing line. They may well go up to 16 quid a packet from next Wednesday. Now, all of these big increases in tobacco duties have not led to increased revenues. It's stayed pretty static at about £10 billion a year. Part of that can be explained by fewer people smoking. But if you think about inflation, it should have gone up way, way more than that over the course of the last decade. No, the reason, folks, is the massive growth of the illegal tobacco market. About 80% of hand-rolling tobacco now comes into this country and is sold illegally. Also, the more expensive cigarettes become, well, actually, you can buy a gram, I'm assured, of cannabis for about a tenner, and that can make you up to 3 joints. So maybe in some ways it's just cheaper to smoke pot than it is to buy cigarettes. But the other alternative, of course, is vaping. And there's been a big move to vaping, and many people saying, actually, it generally does help smokers to stop smoking. Now, I'm not endorsing smoking anything. Of course I'm not. And certainly not moving to illegality. But I do think putting up cigarettes like this is mad, and to do at the same time to put up some big new taxes, we don't quite know what, on vaping, seems to me to be, if you're going to make a health argument, I think actually counterproductive. I'm joined by Reem Ibrahim, Communications Officer for the IEA, and Andre Katruth from the UK Vaping Industry Association. Reem, you guys believe in free markets and free choice, and it just seems to me that taxing... Adam Smith... If you go back to Adam Smith, all those years ago, I'm sure a sort of hero of your organisation.
Oh, absolutely.
But he said if you tax brandy too much, they'll smuggle it from France. Isn't the same argument true here?
Absolutely. So, look, I mean, I can sit here and make the individual liberty argument, and I can tell you that, 1/5 of adults in the United Kingdom are smokers, and that those people should be free to make those life choices. We all know that smoking is bad for us. They tell us it very, very clearly on tobacco packaging, so we all know it's very bad for us, but actually we should be allowing those adults to make those choices for themselves. I think the nanny state need to get out of trying to be involved in people's lives. But even from a public health perspective, we know that actually if the government continuously increase and hike the tobacco duties on tobacco products, actually what that eventually does is it means that you're pushing people to the black market, to the illicit market.
Where there's counterfeit cigarettes and all sorts of things going on. Andre, there are many that believe, and doctors too, that if you switch from, 40 a day to vaping, that is a better thing to do. The argument against the industry is that it's become so trendy amongst youngsters that youngsters who would never, ever smoke at all, and fewer do smoke of a younger age, are taking up vaping. What kind of tax hit are you expecting to see next week?
Well, we can only speculate at the moment.
Yeah.
But clearly the risk is if the government is taking it too far we are talking about proposed bans on disposables, we are talking about taxes. We already know how this will play out because we can look at the Australian market where vaping products have basically been banned.
Yes.
You can only access them on prescription, and 9 out of 10 products in Australia are now being bought from the illicit market. So which takes these products out of the regulated market, out of quality oversight, and it leads to a flourishing black market. The only ones who are benefiting from that are criminals, and the people who are hurt the most are smokers who want to quit smoking. So really, we know that vaping is 95% less harmful than smoking, and we need to help those smokers to quit. And
both of those arguments are very strong and compelling arguments, and I'm with you on both of them. But I return to the question. The teenage craze for vaping is blamed by many on your industry, introducing bubblegum flavour vapes and all sorts of vapes that might attract young people. How do you answer that charge?
Well, I would say unfortunately, there are rogue players in our industry who sell to kids, and we all hate seeing kids vaping. Kids shouldn't vape, shouldn't smoke. We know ideally they wouldn't do any of those, but the responsible industry is not selling to kids. Our average customer age is 37 years old.
Is it?
And we sell bubblegum flavors, we sell all these flavors. 90% of our sales are fruit flavors and sweet flavors. So what we need as an industry, and we've been asking the government now for years to tackle the black market, prosecute those criminals, and introduce a licensing scheme. Because at the moment what you have is that you see barbers, sun tanning studios, lots of rogue traders sell vaping products, and that should not be the case. So what we really need is a licensing scheme which allows only specialized retailers to sell these products.
I get that.
And ensure age
Reem, dying to get back into this debate.
It is already illegal for under 18s to vape. It is already illegal for them to buy tobacco products and vaping products. Now, here's a statistic that most people don't know about. Double the number of 11 to 17-year-olds drink alcohol regularly than vape regularly. But no one is seriously considering a total ban on alcohol for everyone, just because some under 18s manage to get their hands on a bottle of vodka. Right. So ultimately, if we're going to be making the arguments that actually some people that are already banned from buying these products are somehow able to get it, so we should just ban it for everyone. I mean, this is effectively the incremental increase in the nanny state. And effectively, people are using arguments like the environment is bad for the environment, or the young people are getting it, in order to control your lives, in order to control your lifestyle choices. Ultimately, it is already illegal, and I blame the police, I blame the lack of enforcement, I blame the fact that actually in this country we seem to be unable to already enforce the laws that we already have. So my question is, if the government seem to be thinking that banning disposable vapes, increasing tax on tobacco products so they become absolutely unaffordable for everyday people in this country, the question is, who's going to be enforcing these laws?
Well, absolutely nobody, of course, and you're right. And both of you, very, very interesting arguments and very, very strong arguments. And I do think, actually, ultimately, that licensing works. It's been used in many other areas, you know, guns, alcohol, whatever it is. And Reem, for goodness sake, don't use the example of under 18s drinking alcohol.
Because then they'll start banning alcohol.
Because if Rishi Sunak hears that, I think we have a genuinely Puritan Prime Minister who would like to tell us what to do. I'd love to get Jacob's reaction to that debate. Very interesting debate, wasn't it?
It's a very important debate, and there is a balance for the government to strike, that of course you need to raise tax revenue and you want to discourage smoking, but you need to do it at the level that is the most effective, and that is striking tax at the right rate. And all of us who dislike tax need to recognise the government needs to raise money from somewhere, and I quite like it coming from volunteers. You are a fabulous volunteer, Nigel.
Yes.
You smoke and you give money to the government, which means I pay a little bit less tax on other things. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But I mean, it was 10 billion a year 10 years ago. It was raising, you know, put inflation into that, and you would have thought, even though there are fewer smokers, but you would have thought they'd be raising a lot more than 10 billion. They're not. The black market is...
And what you say on hand-rolled tobacco is very important, because you don't want to encourage black markets.
No. No, they don't do any good at all. Now, Jacob, what do you have for us this evening?
Well, there was a wonderful question that you broadcast, or the mad question, to Rishi about the Welsh farmers and the green issue. And there's been a report from the Climate Change Committee that says the fact that we've reduced carbon because of COVID doesn't mean we should carry that forward. We should be even tougher. And this is awful nonsense, because actually net zero is making us much poorer. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. The cheapness of America and the US means the American economy is doing well and ours is stagnant. And it's true, actually, of the whole of Europe. And we need to get away from this green ideology that's really doing a lot of damage to our economy. It's already closing the steel industry. It's hitting farming now, and it will just get worse unless we change it.
And you look at the price of power, you know, without which manufacturing can't exist, and the American industry has half the price, power-wise.
That's right.
That we have. Well, that's it from me. A packed show this evening. Back with you again tomorrow at 7 p.m. But I can't wait to see, now that I'm back in Blighty, what the weather is going to be like.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Mild at first, but we're going to see outbreaks of rain move across the country over the next 24 hours, ushering in colder weather by Friday. Now, we've got low pressure at the moment, anchored to the northwest of Scotland, bringing a series of weather fronts in, but those weather fronts contain mild, albeit cloudy, and increasingly wet weather. The wettest weather will be across Scotland through the evening into northern England and eventually clearing from Wales. That rain sweeping into the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast by the end of the night. Where we've got the cloud and rain, it stays mild, 8 to 10 Celsius, but clearer spells for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Colder here as we begin Thursday, but blustery with strengthening winds, gales for the west and the north of Scotland, and quite a number of showers moving in across Northern Ireland and Scotland, those showers in the colder air falling as snow above around 200 or 300 metres. The showers also follow into Wales in the southwest, but East Anglia in the southeast stays dull and damp through the day, albeit with milder air in place. The cold conditions, though, develop widely by Friday, with the system bringing some outbreaks of rain and hill snow to Wales, the North Midlands, Northern England, Northern Ireland and eventually into parts of Scotland. Rain showers for the south, and in the far north it stays bright. But by Saturday and Sunday, many places will be a little milder with a mix of bright spells and showers, highs of 11 Celsius.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQs live here on GB News. Every Wednesday we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQs live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in the Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. We will be belatedly celebrating World Polar Bear Day.